Just don't forget to unmute if you plan on talking.
All right, we're good.
Yeah,
We're
we'll
live.
All right, we're good? All right, awesome. Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's DPT student live chat. Tonight we have joined with us TJ Janicki, John Childs, Eric Robertson, and David Browder. And what we'll be talking about is based off of the 3 series blog posts that Eric and I wrote on PT Think Tank earlier this week and the end of last week. And just to introduce myself, my name is Lauren Keeley. I'm a second year at Regis University in Denver, Colorado. So what we're going to do first is just have everybody introduce themselves, and then we'll get started on our conversation.
My name is Eric Robertson, and I'm a professor at Regis University in Denver.
Hi, my name is John Childs, and I'm the CEO of Evidence in Motion.
David, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's David Browder. I work with Texas Physical Therapy Specialists in Austin, Texas, and I'm faculty with Evidence in Motion.
And TJ?
And I'm TJ Janicki. I'm a second year at Rutgers University in New Jersey.
So we'll get started tonight basically just by recapping a little bit of what Eric and I wrote about on PT Think Tank earlier this week. It came about just from me and Eric talking about new grads in Colorado. So Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about the main points that you hit on, and we can kind of go from there?
Sure. So the reason I decided to write the post was I was kind of a little bit saddened to hear some of the experiences of some new professionals local to the area in Colorado, and I think I hear it not just in Colorado, but in a lot of areas where sometimes the job market is a little tight, and that tends to be, you know, maybe some cities where people really want to go live, like Colorado. And so, you know, I wrote the blog post to kind of start this conversation and saying, you know, hey, you know, sometimes new professionals are having a really tough time out there, and you know, there's some concerns from clinic owners about not hiring new professionals, and I think there's a couple things there. So the first thing is that it really speaks to a little bit of a disconnect, right? So if owners don't see students as potential new hires as soon as they graduate, well, what's that disconnect from education to the real world? So, you know, how do we solve that? And then the other part of that is, you know, really looking at all the stakeholders in this equation and trying to figure out how we all come together. And that's kind of what I tried to do with the blog series. Instead of it just kind of having to be a big thing where we all complained, I tried to, you know, part one was kind of started the conversation. Part two, Lauren took over and she kind of extolled the benefits from her perspective of new professionals. And then in part three, I tried to bring up a lot of solutions and almost give my recommendations, if you will, for ways to move forward. And I think the most important part of that recommendation is that it's not just one person that needs to make the shift. I think education could reform a little bit. I think clinic owners sometimes have some myths that persist that maybe could change a little bit. And maybe some different cultural shifts and different ideas about business. And I also think students can take a greater role in preparing themselves to fit a little bit better in the marketplace as soon as they graduate.
Yeah, I agree, for sure. So I'm curious to know, John or David, what are your thoughts on, I know that you enjoy hiring new grads, but from a business perspective, what do you think we as students are lacking in our education, and where would you like to see us kind of take that?
David, it's okay. I'll start off, and you can kind of maybe fill in some holes. You know, I think there's a couple of dynamics. One is obviously geography. Part of the dynamics in Colorado, in particular, frankly, is that there's everyone and their brother wants to live in Colorado. Lots of PT students. There's no worse state to practice in from a payment perspective, frankly, than Colorado. I mean, sorry, Lauren, it's just it's a rough market. So the gap in compensation between an entry-level grad and an experienced therapist, frankly, that gap is pretty narrow. So if you're a practice owner, most practice owners sort of take have the mindset that, well, if I can get an experienced therapist, quote unquote, for $3,000 or $5,000 more than I can a new grad, why in the world would I ever hire, a new grad who has no clue how to bill, has no clue how to practice, and is still sort of, green, so to speak. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a valid bias, but that nonetheless is the dynamic, and to some level that exists solely in states like Colorado and New York that have very depressed kind of payment sort of environments that are tough just in PT in general. And so to compete for jobs in those kinds of states as a new grad, you really have to bring a different dynamic, to the table. Be very interested, engaged in the profession, lifelong learning, very eager. You frankly have to be willing to probably work for, at least in the beginning, below market kind of compensation to sort of work your way into an opportunity, sort of the prove yourself first model. I find at least that one of the biggest mistakes students make is they really overvalue what they bring to a practice. And even if they can command a sort of a higher compensation, they make themselves, unintentionally so, they make themselves vulnerable, because now they're paid at a pretty decent premium, which seems like a real good thing to them in the short run, but in the long run, when times get tough, boy, they become vulnerable, because they don't really have the chance to impress their employer. In other words, if you go into an employer and you're sort of average or even below average in compensation, but you can over-deliver in terms of what you bring productivity-wise, culture-wise, enthusiasm, you're an empathetic, caring professional, all of those things, then you set yourself up for longer-term sort of success. So those are just a few of the initial dynamics. I know David, we hire physical therapists all the time at TextBTS, and he interacts with a lot of our folks day in and day out. So I know he's got some interesting perspective to bring as well. David?
Yeah, I would say we really like to hire new graduates, and a lot of the reason why is that we can put them through our training programs, we can work on developing them, and we don't have sort of the preconceived notion that they've got a lot of years under their belt. We're of the belief that 1 year repeated endlessly doesn't gain you a lot of experience. It doesn't gain you a lot of value. So a 3 or a 4 year veteran PT that hasn't done much in that 3 or 4 years to us isn't really any more valuable than a new grad who we can start off that's very hungry. So really it comes down to having that sort of fire in you to continue to learn and grow and to want to develop. And amazingly enough, that fits very well, especially with the Gen Y sort of new grads that are coming out that are hungry to learn. So if you have a residency, or if you have the developmental model where you're trying to take people and help them grow into being more successful in your company, new grads are a great group of folks to hire. Then the question for the new grad becomes, well, how do I find that company and then make sure I'm the right person for them to hire? And I think what a lot of people are running into is they have a lot of student loans, and so they tend to go for maybe the higher salaries, and the challenge becomes finding the right mix of a decent salary with the developmental stuff that the people want.
David, I want to kind of ask you a question. You talked a little bit about the same year repeated over and over again, and that's one of the things that kind of drives me nuts a little bit when I look around and see what PTs are advertising in terms of job postings around here. They all seem to want that like random, generic 3 to 5 years of experience. And it's really tough for a new professional to get their foot in the door, even to communicate at all with that business owner. What do you think? I agree with you, obviously. 3 to 5 years, to me, that's maybe, if you're not doing some sort of significant professional development, just 3 to 5 years that you can forget things. So what's your strategy maybe to students who get that sort of job posting? Is there a way to navigate that?
Well, I think you have to still apply for the job, and you have to tell the person that you're interested in really becoming a great therapist. Not just, I don't want to be a mediocre therapist 3 or 4 years from now looking for a new job and a new place to go. I want to work with your company to become a great therapist, and I'm willing to work extra hard to do it. And I think the key to the 3 to 5 year therapist is not that they're any better at therapy. I think the reason people want to hire a 3 to 5 year therapist is they don't have to teach the new grad what it's like to go to work 40 or 50 hours a week and to really see a full caseload. They've usually already figured out at 3 to 5 years that PT in a lot of ways is about seeing patients, and it's a grind at times. And so they don't want to take the time to take the new grad through that initial experience. So if a new professional comes in saying, hey, look, I know it's going to be a lot of hard work and that it's going to take me a while to get up to speed, and so I know I'm not going to make as much as somebody that's got 3 or 5 years of experience, starting off at that point helps a lot. What you can't do is say, I have $70,000 of student loans, and so I need this salary. I'm surprised I can't find a job. You got to start off with some realistic expectations, not undervaluing yourself, but also realizing in a busy job market like Colorado that you're probably going to take a hit just to get the job in the first place.
So, and I guess that my next follow-up question to that would be, what are those skills that a student could focus on right away that would help them mitigate that maybe productivity problem where they're not as slick on the ground as somebody who's been doing this job for 3 years?
Well, I think that's where the clinical internships have to come in. In that final internship, if you're like, for example, if your goal is to be an outpatient physical therapist, your final internship should be about not just getting some clinical skills and seeing a lot of patients. It should be about getting used to the pace of clinical life and about being able to handle a normal caseload worth of patients. And if your clinical instructor isn't giving you that, it's usually because you're not asking for it. I've rarely met a clinical instructor who doesn't want to shovel more work onto a student or an intern. If they aren't, it's usually because they don't think they can handle it. By the end of a clinical internship, an intern should be seeing a full caseload. And if you can go into an employer and say, hey, look, I know how to see patients. Here's the productivity I did at my last internship, that will take a lot of that concern away. If you go in and say, what I really am looking for is a place where I see one patient for an hour by myself with 2 hours for an evaluation and plenty of time to do my documentation, it's going to be very hard to find a job because those jobs don't exist. Right? And so having reasonable expectations and understanding the productivity required, especially in a harsh payment environment like Colorado, goes a long way towards employers feeling comfortable with a new professional.
Yeah, and I would just echo David's comments. I think, where educational programs really get it wrong and where, frankly, students get handicapped is when they get presented in a sort of an ivory tower setting, this unrealistic expectation of what practice should look like. And so students oftentimes come into a very busy outpatient clinical setting, very naive, having this sort of idealistic expectation that I'm going to see one patient in an hour, as David alluded to, and I need a full hour and a half sometimes to see a new patient. And to the practice management staff and owners, it's just an unsustainable model. Add to that sometimes a bias that says, well, if I charge more than 3 units, I'm somehow committing fraud, and all these other just crazy misconceptions about how to thrive in practice. It really sets you up for failure as a student, and oftentimes it's not the student's fault. I hate to say it this way, and this is going to sound overly cynical, but if you look at the sort of the profile of the average individual in academic settings, and I think I can sort of beat up on this because I'm one of these myself in academics. It's a lot of folks who've been in practice for whatever reason, decided it wasn't for them, and so now they're in academics. That's why they're in academics. And so oftentimes they have very misguided notions about what it takes to thrive in practice because they haven't been in practice for quite some time. As David said, the student who can go into a busy outpatient setting and really fit into that environment, they are emotionally mature, they can handle the crisis of multiple patients and the problem patient and the new patient who is now getting jammed into their schedule, and they can thrive in that environment. As a practice owner, that's the student that you're going to want to hire. And frankly, the clinical skills, don't get me wrong, they're important. But it's that emotional IQ, it's that ability to multitask, to think on your feet. You can train skills all day long. That whole emotional maturity sort of work ethic gene, that's something I feel less confident about being able to shape. It's there or it's sort of not there, and boy, when it's there, that's a student that you will hire in a heartbeat.
So I think that's a really good. So basically, what I'm hearing is that some students don't understand that a practice is a business, and there is a business to be run. And I think that that's where some of the DPT programs might lose out a little bit, you know, because I worked before I went to PT school, so I understand the 50, 60-hour weeks. So I guess my question to you guys, and also please, Eric, I would love to hear your input on this. One, where do you think PT programs need to improve on their business education? And two, what do you think? So John, you had mentioned that, you know, you'd be more apt to hire the individual that comes in that, you know, isn't scared of multitasking and is like ready to go, even if their clinical skills, you know, need to be worked on. How do you get that across in an interview as well?
You know, I guess I'll talk a little bit about where I think educational programs can reform, and you know, really, there's a ton of space for it. And well, I say there's a ton of space for reform. There's not necessarily a ton of space to fit the reform, and that's one of the problems. Is that as an educator, you're really up against this time clock, and there's so much you want to teach the students. There's simply just not enough time for it. So I really think it's going to take a lot of innovation to come up with strategies where this business component of physical therapy education isn't its own little unit that you get at the end of the educational process. It's something that's woven throughout the curriculum, and it's stressed over and over and over again. Something like you use you know, an electronic medical record, and when you solve patient cases, you know, you're under a time clock for it. You know, and there's times when that's appropriate and there's times when it's not, but I think there really needs to be some innovation in education so that the business part of this is woven throughout it. You know, I think preparing students to hit that like minimum clinical skill requirement is great, and that's our primary job. But you know, a little bit more broadly than that, our primary job is to prepare the students in our programs to be really successful as employees right away, and you can't lose sight of that.
You know, WebPT has a very interesting program that they're doing with some of the schools where they actually incorporate their EMR into the learning process, and instructors can assign scenarios. I don't know if you guys have this in your program, and then the students can actually document the case in an EMR and code the case out like you would in a real outpatient setting. And that, I think, is very useful because it teaches the whole range of skills, everything from understanding how a diagnosis code has to be made to how the CPT codes have to be done in order to get paid, which is one of the first things we spend a lot of time teaching new professionals how to do within our clinical practice. The other piece is just learning how to document with a computer, which I think has gotten better, but that's certainly something where if we're doing handwritten documentation, there's a learning curve for learning how to be empathetic and caring with patients, and then switch over to an electronic medical record system.
Yeah, just a few, and Lauren, you alluded to this, you know, how to prospective, you know, new grads, how do they communicate to employers and those sorts of things. You know, whenever I hear a prospective new grad talk about, well, they need X amount of salary so they can make a loan payment, that's a red flag to me, because that suggests that they have no concept that actually the compensation that they're going to be paid has much more to do with the value that they can add to the practice. And so, you know, a therapist who can understand how their compensation is ultimately tied to the value that they bring to the practice, that's the educated therapist that now we're tracking. Now, I'm not suggesting you know, student debt doesn't matter. Of course it does, and as employers we care about that immensely. And we've certainly realized that therapists have to be able to, you know, put food on the table and pay their bills and all those sorts of things. But your student debt is no factor when determining, you know, someone's compensation and what value they add to the practice. So there's just, you know, I like to think about it this way. You know, we oftentimes you know, ask therapists, you know, sort of what are the top 5 things you're looking for in a practice, you know, and you'll hear the common answers like culture, chance to, to do continuing education, location, convenience, whatever it may be, compensation. And I usually think of it this way, a therapist who says their salary is their number one driver, their number one motivator, at least in our practice at Tex PTS, they're probably not going to be a great fit in our practice. On the other hand, if compensation is not in the top 5, then they're probably lying. And we don't want them for that reason, either. So our optimal therapist is where, typically that lifelong learning, is sort of in that 1-2 range, along with culture, great team environment, compensations in that 3-4 range. That's the kind of therapist that now is starting to fit at least the profile that we're looking for.
Great. I think you guys have done a really great job so far, kind of putting into perspective on what students really should be looking out for, and sort of what's more realistic in terms of breaking into a new job or breaking into private practice settings. So on Twitter, Aaron Cantu kind of brought up a good point on being able to recognize when a job offer is sort of too good to be true. So are there any things that the students should sort of be looking out for? I mean, if they're offered something at a job, what is something that might trigger that too good to be true?
Yeah, so I'll give you a few. David can, because I hear these stories all the time. So too good to be true. You're going to be getting paid $75,000 a year in an outpatient setting, and you're going to see 1 patient an hour, about 8 patients a day. The practice is either desperate, in other words, they can't, their culture's so bad that they have to pay you those kind of dollars to recruit therapists, or they're potentially committing fraud. And either of those reasons should be reasons to run for the hills. So that's a common one. David's smiling. He's probably got a full list of others. What are some other ones you hear, David?
Well, I just got to say, that 3 to 5 year therapist comes to visit me pretty frequently, right? And we tend to hire more new professionals than we do 3 to 5 year therapists. And typically they make way more than we pay, and they're trying to get away from a physician-owned practice where they've got kind of the golden handcuffs, right? They make way more money than maybe 10 or 15 grand more than our therapists do, but they spend most of their time looking for a new job because they hate it where they're at, because they aren't autonomous, because they don't feel respected, they don't like their workplace, they end up working in a place where they don't like. And I just have to tell you, money is not worth it. It really isn't. Even if you have student loans, I mean, student loans, especially in those first couple of years, should not dictate what you're doing. Those first couple of years in PT should really be about growing into the kind of professional you want to be. And so you should put salary and compensation maybe 3rd or 4th on the list. And the first couple of 3 should be being in a place where you know you're going to be happy, where you're going to like the kind of patients that you're seeing, and where you're going to get great mentorship. And those should be the primary things that drive that initial job decision. Or otherwise you can be like these guys that are 3 to 5 years out. They're miserable, they're trying to find new jobs, and if they can't find one, then they might try to find a new profession because they simply aren't happy even though they're making more money than they might elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. I mean, personally, I'm not going to make as much money as I did as an accountant, but to me that it wasn't worth it. But Eric, I kind of want to bring it back to you to talk a little bit more about how we can continue to integrate business in the profession, as well as I'd like for you to talk a little bit about this, partnership model that you mentioned in the third post on PT Think Tank this week.
Yeah, so I guess the partnership model thing that I mentioned, one of my recommendations, I think it was 4 recommendations, said, hire partners, not employees. And I mean that both literal and figurative. And I think what I mean by that is I need somebody to be invested into the company. And that might be emotional investment, and you view yourself as somebody who's part of that culture and wants to grow the company. But I also mean that as more of a financial thing. And if you go to some of the conferences like the Private Practice Section Conference, you hear a lot of talk about succession planning and having partners in a business. And you have to kind of sit back and ask yourself, why doesn't physical therapy use more of this model that you see a lot in medical practices and in law practices, where you have junior partners that progress to senior partners, and you have this ownership share in the clinic. I've kind of found that just through my own experience, it's been a little bit challenging for existing PT clinics to really fold into that kind of shared ownership model, and I think there's some realities there. So students that are graduating, they don't have a lot of capital on hand. They have more likely loans and debt things, and so it's hard for them to come up with like the upfront capital to buy into an already existing business that has value and equity. So I really kind of almost made a suggestion that new forming businesses could think about that on the front end and maybe use that as a model going forward, a little bit easier than existing practices. But my overall point on that was, and this starts really when you're in school, view yourself as somebody who's going to be an asset to a business, whether or not you do have an ownership share. It's just that figurative emotional share. How do you help that business grow? And that's really the point. If you can envision yourself as a member of that business's culture, then I think that guides how you do things in school, and it guides how you, what kind of additional learning opportunities and experiences you find. And so if you can envision that in yourself early on, even before you're at that job application, I think it really benefits you.
Yeah, I agree. I think that more students kind of need to take ownership of their own education as well, and then kind of look for these opportunities and think of themselves as assets. But I know that it's definitely a two-way street, and if I went and I interviewed somewhere and I had this attitude of not cocky but confident in the sense of I will be an asset to you, I know a lot, I can help your business, John and David, what do you think of that attitude as far as a new grad goes? And then how do you respond for when they say what's my potential for growth here? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I can just tell you how I think about it. I view business relationships, frankly, not unlike marriage. And as someone who's been married for going on 20 years, it's got its ups and downs, regardless of the phase that it's in. And that decision of deciding who you're going to marry, assuming you're in it for life, that's a pretty serious decision. And so you're going to date, you're going to court. It's just not one of those decisions you just meet, at a bar and decide to get married. I realize that happens sometimes. That usually doesn't work out real well. Frankly, business law, and so it's tougher to break up a business than it is a marriage. So in other words, when you get into business together and you decide you no longer want to be in business, separating yourself in business is much more difficult than getting a divorce. So as someone, so you've got to choose your business partners very carefully. And so to me, dating in business makes all sorts of sense, especially with new grads who oftentimes have conceived ideas of what ownership means. Sometimes they're informed, sometimes they're totally misinformed, sometimes they're in between. But a couple of years of figuring that out, a lot of times they may be at a different stage of life. Now they've got kids. Ownership now. That was something they wanted to do, but no longer do they have any interest. They've seen now their practice owner. I hear this all the time about, wow, you're a practice owner. No one's looking over your shoulder deciding what your hours are. And I just joke with them and I say, yeah, I get to pick which 18 hours a day that I want to work. I get to choose my 18 hours. And so in any event, a lot of people have misconceived ideas of what that looks like. So I just think it's important to communicate very clearly. Everybody's interests are different. Some people want to be owners. Some people are perfectly fine being in an employee sort of mindset. Regardless, I think to Eric's point, being invested emotionally and otherwise, like you're an owner, that goes a long ways in sort of availing yourself to future opportunities, should that be something you desire.
Yeah, I would just say, I think that I'll agree with John. And my screen's doing something a little funny. So can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, David.
Okay, good. I'll just ignore the fact that I can't see anybody anymore. But I'm going to agree with John. I think that the perception of what a private practice is and what a private practice owner does is maybe different for all PTs that aren't in that world. And it's one of those things you really can't be in the middle of until you're doing it. Um, and so I think the key thing is that you don't jump into that sort of I'm going to open a private practice mindset until you really have a good idea of at least what's entailed and the risks that are involved. And so you'll often hear private practice owners say, well, you just don't really understand, the business and what's going on. And what they're trying to tell you is they're staying awake at night worrying about whether or not they can meet payroll because of something that you don't understand about how the money works in the business. And so usually when you're talking about becoming a partner or gaining partnership in the business, you really want to have a good, firm grasp on how that business works. So for example, working as a manager or running a clinic within the business for a year or 2 or 3 or 4, and then really understanding the business and how you contribute, and then seeing whether or not a partnership is the right way to go for you, because clinic ownership definitely isn't for everybody, and most PTs are pretty risk adverse.
Yeah, if I can just add one thing, and this is now on the backside of having been involved in a multi-site practice for a number of years. If I was going back in time, number one, I wouldn't do much differently than I did. I spent a lot of time as an employee, working my rear end off, demonstrating my value, and then the opportunities came naturally from that. Where I see a lot of mistakes made is you have these very eager folks who think that they're smart enough, wise enough, savvy enough to open a practice on their own. They go out into private practice, they open up a location by themselves. I would never open a private practice by myself. Never, never, never. I would never do that. There's just too many nuances. Even at this stage, I wouldn't do it because there's just too many nuances. I want a team around me, and I also want to scale my practice. Frankly, the economics of private practice and PT make very little sense with one location unless you've got a really large location where you've got 5, 6, 7, therapists. I can tell you the individual private practice owner that is in one location, even if they're the sole owner of their business, they may be working for themselves, but they're the employee, they're the janitor, they're the owner, their name's on the lease, they don't sleep well at night. If that's what you want, if that's what you envision ownership being like, have at it, I can assure you that isn't my vision of what ownership looks like. I would much rather be a smaller part of a growing pie than to have 100% ownership in a single clinic where its entire success sort of hinges on me.
I think those are a lot of great points, and I think that because it seems like private practice and going into the business part of PT is a big topic right now, and I think that's a big question a lot of a student's mind is when can I break out on my own, and when can I decide what my value is. So I think those are great perspectives for students to kind of to think about, and I think the idea of definitely gaining some sort of clinical experience is a must before you kind of jump into private practice, and then the owning of business is a whole nother beast in its own. But I have a quick question sort of based around breaking into private practice. So because I feel like when I go to my job interviews, I feel like I'm going to be pumped up, I'm going to be ready to go, and I'll be like, listen, I'm invested, and I'm in for the long haul. So how do you because I feel like it would be natural for every student to be like that on their first interview. So is it more of like a risk when you kind of accept a student that you don't really know too well right away, or is it basically, to me it seems like it would be a risk, but how do you kind of weed out who's being genuine and who's sort of not? That's a fair question.
Oh, well, I'll try to tackle that. The real answer is that interviews don't tell you a whole lot. Usually what we usually try to do is find a good fit for culture and recognize that once the person commits to coming and working for us, whether or not they're going to stay for a couple of years has a lot more to do with how we do in developing that person than it does with whether making that person a part of our culture than it does with whether or not that person initially intends to stay. There's a really neat book I like called I forget the name now, but it's about Gen Y, and it's about how to about how Gen Y usually decides whether they're going to stay with a job within the first 15 minutes, and whether or not they're going to call their friends and tell them how much they like it. And so really for employers, paying attention to that initial experience and then paying attention to that first year and really making sure they develop their new employees, that really to me is when you have the option, is when you give someone the option of staying for a couple of years. If people are leaving leaving pretty frequently, it's not because they weren't committed in the beginning. It's usually because the employer didn't provide a great experience for them. So, I'm never listening for somebody who's like, well, I want to work here for 6 months and go somewhere else. I'm more listening for the right fit for the culture, because I know if it's a good fit for the culture, it's a good lifelong learner that's going to want the development stuff that we offer, then they're going to stay with us for a long time.
Yeah, I tell you, I just briefly on that point, I like the Zappos model. We don't do this at TextBTS, but conceptually we have some of these elements. So at Zappos, any of you buy shoes online know Zappos, amazing culture, they hire great people, but they recognize that they don't always get the right folks. And so at the roughly 90-day point, they basically offer people, they'll write them a check for, I don't know what the number is, $2,500, they'll give people $3,000 to leave. Take a check and run. And that says a lot about whether the person's truly vested at that point. On our side, we typically recruit our new therapists through the residency or through the manual therapy certification or some long-term educational track. That therapist is vested. They usually will fund roughly 50% of that expense. So we feel like we get a good handle on whether someone's truly vested by their willingness to invest their hard-earned dollars into their long-term education. So that's sort of their ticket, if you will, that they lay down that says, hey, I'm all in. And so that, first 60 to 90 days is a real critical, we call it re-recruitment, rehire, re-interview. If you don't have the right person, it'll show up quickly, and when that happens, it's good for both parties to split early as opposed to later.
So I have a follow-up question for either John or David. So you talk about wanting to hire people that are, lifelong learners and see you with the long run, but truly, what is their potential for growth? Like, how come you guys don't do a, junior, senior, partner level thing that we see so much in medical models and other business models? What holds you back from doing that?
I'll take a first stab. I'm not quite sure we don't do that. If you looked at our structure as owners, partners, profit-sharing employees, it is, David could tell you, my head spins. It's literally all over the map because we try to create unique incentives, compensation strategies, ownership around the individual and where they are, stage of life, what they've proven out. So I don't think, at least in a larger organization, you can have this black and white junior, senior, partner sort of model, because I think the shades of gray in people and stages of life are just too variable. And so so that's why we don't have it in that concrete sort of way. But we have plenty of our therapists who are owners. We have others who are in a profit-sharing sort of an arrangement where they're basically like owners. In fact, some of our folks who have profit-sharing arrangements, sometimes, and David can relate to this, I look at that and I go, why am I not doing more of that? You get a lot of the reward and, frankly, not all the risk. So it's, what ownership means, the realities and perception sometimes are very, very different. And so you just have to have ongoing discussion and education and transparency so that you can really customize someone's growth plan, not just around what they say they want, but what the true sort of, you have to read into what they're saying and come to some middle ground of true understanding of what they're saying versus what they may understand to be the case. David, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, but I think the other piece to remember is just that most people don't really want what partnership is. They might want the ability to make unlimited earnings or the ability to have flexibility, but those aren't necessarily the same things as partnership. Partnership is really being financially responsible for the success of a practice. And so there are some models out there. I mean, I'll use in Oklahoma City, there's one called PT Central, a guy named Bridget Finley, that's taken and been 50-50 partners with maybe 10 or 11 different people to really grow her practice. And that's a great example of a practice that's been able to take and people that are really interested in growing a practice with some mentored learning and been able to really be successful that way. Those are more few and far in between, and not everybody that comes into that practice became a partner. TextBTS, like John mentioned, is a great example. I'm what you would call a junior partner almost. I bought into the practice later in the game. I wasn't one of the initial partners. So there's definitely ways to do that, but the key thing to remember is that you never get something for nothing. And if anybody ever offers you to be a half owner and maybe you don't have any buy-in and it seems too good to be true, the answer is it's probably too good to be true. What you're probably buying into is half of a failing practice that has a lot of debt. That's a lesson that I learned early on. There's no such thing as a free ride when it comes to partnership. If you're not paying for it, it doesn't probably have a whole lot of value. Now, that doesn't mean there might not be some succession plans and ways that you can really do well, maybe taking over somebody else's practice and that sort of thing. Be very careful. The world of partnership doesn't always come with just sort of the unlimited rewards and flexibility that you might think it has. It's a great way to go, but it's not easy.
Yeah, and this gets back to this too good to be true, and this is to echo David's point. If you look at the real serious investors in the market, I mean, take private equity groups and venture capital that are interested in getting into the PT market, they would much rather pay a premium high dollar for a thriving practice than to get a practice on the cheap that has no management and really ability to scale. So, I like to look at people who've been successful and try to copy what they're doing, right? I mean, that maybe sound real simple, but find someone who's achieved success and then say, can you teach me? And then do what they tell you to do. And don't ask too many questions, just do it. And so for me, that means if I'm going to buy into a practice, I want to try to come up with some dollars and buy into a practice that has real ongoing value, as opposed to these too good to be true scenarios. And I just saw one the other day, one of our previous therapists, grass was greener. We stay connected to our therapists. I mean, there's always good faith. And and has now communicated to us he's got this practice that's going to basically give him the practice. Not going to have to pay anything for it. And all sorts of red flags in my mind are going up. I mean, I'm seeing what David alluded to. There's probably all sorts of debt on the books. This guy's pretty unsophisticated. How much due diligence he's going to do? Is he going to be able to do? And I really, truly, genuinely worry about these folks because they feel like they've gotten the deal of a lifetime, and in all likelihood, they're probably being given a lemon that comes with far more headaches and risks. So it's common sense. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If there's anything I've learned over the years, it's the old adage that there is no free lunch, and that's really true.
So one thing that Eric mentioned in his blog post, and what I've heard from so many classmates that came before me and graduated, is that they were given an interview and then just never called back. And I think that kind of speaks to the professional behavior and culture of a clinic. So I guess my question for you guys is, what do you think the professional behaviors as employers are?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if the culture of you should be just as picky as the employer should be when looking for a place where you're going to work. If you go into a place and they treat you like you don't deserve to be there even to do the interview, why would you want to go work at that place? Right? I mean, you should be interviewing them at the same time. I mean, even at TextBTS, when we have people that we know we aren't going to hire because based on whatever their phone interview If for whatever reason we decide, well, we're going to go ahead and try a face-to-face interview, it doesn't matter. We still spend our whole time trying to make sure that we're selling them on why they need to come work for us anyway. Because at minimum, that's the first impression that our new employee is going to have of what our culture is like. All right, so if you go to an interview and you don't feel good about working there, keep looking. I mean, there's definitely, I mean, I know, okay, yeah, the job market's rough in Colorado, but maybe you should move away from Colorado if you can't get a job there, but more, you should really be looking for a place that you're going to enjoy and have fun coming to work. You know, I don't remember who it was that said if you love going to work, then you'll never work a day in your life, something along that lines. I think that's true. If you really like the people you're around and if you like the workplace, that's probably going to be apparent from the very beginning when you're doing the interview. You should be laughing and having a good time, and it shouldn't be a sort of stiff, formal affair, or otherwise you probably are looking at a culture that's going to be stiff and formal that you're not going to enjoy.
Yeah, I would almost suggest that for somebody who's entering this work field, you're not really sure like what the behaviors you should expect from an employer. You know, if they don't call you back, if they, run you through hoops, they cancel on you, that maybe they're late, all of those things. You know, try to remember how the university acted when you applied to PT school. Because that's really, in a way, a little bit of a similar situation where, it's a competitive environment. You're trying to get in. Not everybody's going to get in. But at the same time, the school has to not only select you, but sell you on the culture of the school and the university. And so think back to that time and think back to what happened during that interview that, did the school make you feel good or did it not? Did you feel like you were just kind of wandering around on your own, or did you feel like they cared about you genuinely? And just try to remember back to that. And I think it's a good strategy. It really makes me sad sometimes when I see some of those kind of negative professional behaviors from employers, and I see students who are so kind of eager to work there, and they have this idea what the place is, but really what that place is really showing you is its true colors, and that maybe they don't respect you as much as they should.
I'll give you here's a free interview tip. All right, I mean, I do a lot of interviews and a lot of new grad interviews, and I will tell you something that always impresses me is when the person interviewing is very prepared for the interview. They've got a list of questions for me, and to be honest, sometimes they're asking me a bunch of questions I don't know the answers to. What that tells me is that they're very serious and committed about this job. It tells me something about grit and resilience, and their willingness to kind of go the extra mile to make sure that they get that right first job. So just having a list of questions and being willing to ask the other person questions is very valuable. I don't know if you know this, but the person asking the questions is the one running the conversation. So don't be afraid to ask the person interviewing questions about their business. I want people who want to know about our culture and what we're like and our business and the way we're going to develop them. And are interviewing me as much as I'm interviewing them. Somebody that only responds to my questions, I know they're nervous, and I don't usually get enough back from them to really get a great feel for their personality. And that's what you have to show, is your personality and how prepared you are.
Yeah, the other piece is if you can get a recommendation from within the company. I mean, we trust. I mean, our employees who know our culture, they know us, they know what we're looking for. When they come to us and they've got a classmate that is about to graduate and they represent this individual as, boy, this person has TextPTS DNA, that goes a long way. So, so to David's point, it's not just reading the website, but it's investing yourself in a practice enough, either having done an internship there, someone who's working there now. You've really gotten to know the inner workings. As David said, boy, that goes a long way when you hear that individual communicating things about your culture and your staff, that, boy, for them to know that kind of information, they have to be sort of an insider. It speaks volumes. When you get these very uninformed sorts of questions and they don't even know where your locations are and those kinds of things, or who maybe some of the key players are, it just sort of it suggests a very casual approach. Another real turnoff, and this may just be a personal hang-up for me, there's nothing I hate worse than those phone calls where somebody wants to interview and then they want you to pay $500 for them for an airfare, a couple $100 for a hotel. It's just like, for me, it's not really about the money. It's really not. It's about the inconvenience of having to take the time to even do the mechanics of that stuff. I mean, in other words, just show up, and when you just show up and you make it easy, it makes all the difference in the world. You're on time, you're dressed professionally, you're ready to invest yourself, spend a day with the practice, really get to know the staff. It's just all those sort of that emotional sort of IQ. It's that it factor, and when you have that factor, boy, that comes across very readily. And within 5 minutes, I'm thinking we got to find a home for this person. I don't even know if we have a job open, but David knows you get the right person. It's like you just hire them and then you figure it out later. That's the kind of person that you really want to hire.
So what I'm getting from you guys and from the past 50 minutes of talking is basically that DPT new grads need to understand that we are an asset to a clinic, and we need to act like we're an asset to a clinic without thinking that we are very deserving of super high salaries and being unrealistic from job offers. TJ, do we have any questions coming in from Twitter?
I do. I saw a question that I like, actually. And the question was, so what do employers think when they see somebody who's just recently graduated from a residency and maybe they're a certified specialist? Do they consider that person still entry-level therapist even if they haven't had a lot of work experiences? So say that's that person who left school, went right into maybe an apprentice-type residency model, and now they're looking for their first job external to any learning environment. What do you think about that? Is that still an entry-level therapist?
No, absolutely not. I mean, if you ask me, one of the very most valuable things you can do is get your specialty. I mean, of course, our name is Texas Physical Therapy Specialist, so it's obviously something we value. But no, that kind of, not for one thing, it takes a special kind of person to go that route and to put in that extra effort and to make sure that happens earlier in their career. So to me, that's a high performer, an emerging leader, and that's somebody that we're going to want to grab onto. That being said, it's important to know that the way physical therapists make money is per unit of time that they're putting hands on patients. And a 20-year veteran can't see a lot more patients than a 3-year veteran can. And that's why you don't see massive salaries growing as people get older. You just have to understand how physical therapists are paid, and it really puts a cap on how much people make. So you just have to have reasonable expectations for what that salary and stuff looks like, and realize it has nothing to do with whether you have a DPT or whether you come from this school or that school. It has a lot more to do with the economics of how physical therapists are paid in a service industry, and that's what we're part of.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I really appreciated Eric's post on the PT Think Tank post, because I think there's a lot of confusion, especially for new grads, as to when that stigma sort of goes away. Is there a certain amount of years before you're not considered a new grad anymore, or does it depend on when you get another specialty or when you get a manual therapy certification, or does it depend on a certain amount of clinical years? So I mean, from a business owner standpoint, is there, besides going out and getting that besides getting that specialty certification, is there a certain point in time where you're no longer considered a new grad or a new professional?
Go ahead, David.
I think, I've got a guy that's a couple of years out of school, maybe 2-3 years out of school. It's running one of our better practices, and I've encountered PTs who are 15 years out of school that haven't learned much since they got out of school. I think everybody's different. I think, again, we'll go back to this idea of resilience and grit, and how that's more important than being clinically smart or having a sort of technical skill. Emotional intelligence and being able to lead and manage are totally different skill sets than being able to take a knee and move it in the right way. So you have to have those things, but I think that gaining that leadership and management and taking the ability to take on more tasks in a clinic, that's what, to me, is somebody developing more than the simple, okay, you've been around for 3 or 4 or 5 years. That's not the way it will be everywhere, but it's certainly, I think, in a private practice setting, results are what people look for, the ability to be productive without sort of getting burned out. those are the things that sort of elevate you, if you will, as opposed to sort of maybe more of a tenure-based environment like you might find maybe in a hospital system, where whoever sticks around the longest kind of becomes the person in charge.
Yeah, I guess I could follow up with that and say, you're no longer a new grad when you stop acting like one. And I don't mean that as like a behavioral sense, but when you have gained those skills that people are afraid of about a new grad, and it's good to understand. And one of the first things David said was about learning the billing and the documentation. So one of the first things they have to teach people when they just get out of school. If you take the onus on yourself to understand that and to be competent at that during your internships, well, I have a hard time classifying you as that new professional fully, because you have a skill that most new professionals don't have. So think of it as a point of professional development, not necessarily if I work like 7 months and I'm not a new grad, or if I take a second job and I'm not a new grad. That's really second to the skill set that you have.
I think that's a really good point, Eric. As we are kind of closing up, I want to point out 2 things that might be useful for DPT students. One thing that Eric linked to in, I believe it was his 3rd blog post, is something called Coursera, and it's basically free online classes. And I know you're probably thinking, I already take enough classes, I don't want to take any more classes. But TJ and I just signed up for healthcare innovation and entrepreneurship. So I feel like that's kind of one thing that you can do to learn a little bit more. And then also the private practice section will become a really good place for students to learn more on the business side of clinics. And there will be more information coming on that soon. So do you guys kind of just want to wrap up a little bit and we'll be finished for the evening?
Yeah, I would just say, just in conclusion, if I had to sort of sum up how to be successful in life, it's to find someone, based on what you know now, realizing that your vision for the future may change over time, find someone who's where you want to be and find how you can get associated with that individual, that group. And the good news in our profession, there's a lot of those folks out there, and stick yourself to them like a magnet, and add value to their world, their life, and your opportunities will blossom when you do that. I mean, that sounds oversimplistic, but at the end of the day, if you want to be successful, you really have to find mentors and colleagues who've actually been successful. They haven't talked about it, they haven't written about it. I mean, they may have done all those things too, but you can actually see a balance sheet and a pro forma and a financial statement that proves that that individual, in fact, has achieved some measure of whatever you envision as success. To me, that's the key. It's really finding the right mentorship is the magic sort of potion, if you will.
Well, that was really good, John. I don't know if I want to follow that up. I'll just repeat what I said earlier about making sure that you're happy in the culture and the place that you're working. If you're not happy at work, you're not going to enjoy being a physical therapist. Physical therapy is a lot of work. So make sure that that first job that you have is really doing the kind of patients that you want to see. It's with the kind of people that you want to work around, and it allows you to really grow and learn within the profession, learn to master this art and science of physical therapy. And don't settle for something that seems like I can just do it for a year, or I'll do this travel PT thing for a while. Don't settle for that. Find the place where you really think like you're going to enjoy being a physical therapist, and don't wait to try to do that sort of dream job later. Find it early in your career, and you'll really enjoy being a physical therapist a lot more for it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, David. It's kind of when you take ownership of the occupation you're about to become a part of is really what makes it a lot more enjoyable. And definitely personally for me, when I really engaged in the broader profession is when I got a lot more satisfaction back from physical therapy. I guess the thing I would hope to close with is that we're really all partners in this. Whether you're a business owner or you're a student or you're an educator, we're all after the same mission here, which is to get people better through physical therapy and to promote physical therapy as a profession and to keep it strong and healthy. And to that end, I think it's I would hope that this discussion continues forward and is really a collaborative discussion. If you're in a school and you're not feeling like you're getting enough business education, well, take some ownership to find some opportunities for yourself, but also, there's some course evals that you could talk to your program about in a constructive manner and kind of combine that conversation so that things can change where they need to, and there are some systemic things I think can change. It's not all a personal thing, although I think a lot of tonight's conversation was about that personal aspect, which is undoubtedly huge. So that would be my thing. I hope this conversation continues on in a real collaborative sense.
I agree, and one thing, Eric, that you had mentioned in the third blog post as well is that students move faster than education does. So it's really important that you kind of take ownership where if you feel like you're not getting enough business education, okay, well, you can make suggestions for the program to change. It might not happen while you're there. So it's important to kind of take ownership of that. TJ, do you want to add some closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to thank you guys so much for coming on and kind of continuing this conversation off of Twitter, because there was a lot of really great conversation sort of revolving around this topic, and I think it's really important, like Eric said, to continue the conversation, and just want to kind of plug that everyone should check out the blog post, the 3-part blog series on ptthinktank.com, and definitely leave your comments there because there's a lot of good conversation going on there as well. So just wanted to thank you guys so much before we logged off, but that's my final comment.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, glad to have you guys
everybody.
on.
Appreciate it.
Thank you again.